Writer, poet, novelist Dr. Prakash Kona needs no introduction. But for those of us who don't, he has been a professor at the EFL University for the past 7 years. A man of eclectic taste, his area interests range from literary writing, popular culture, social history, all the way to street culture. I request you to kindly introduce our keynote speaker, Mr. Paranjoy Guha Thakurta. Over to you, sir.
I would like to introduce this morning a well-known public intellectual, Paranjoy Guha Thakurta. And I deliberately use the word public intellectual, not merely to make a distinction from academics or social historians, but to stress on the fact that a great part of the mental life of a public intellectual is about being involved with issues related to the functioning of governments and whether political justice is being served in everyday life. As academic involved in reading social history through literary works, my job is to a large extent about looking at the truth in as many ways as is possible. The public intellectual is not only an interpreter of truths, but someone dedicated to relating the truths to the possibility of social and political change. This is the context in which Paranjoy Guha Thakurta's work needs to be understood. As a public intellectual, he has been actively involved in writing, publishing, and producing documentaries that connect with issues related to the masses. The titles of his books, A Time of Coalitions, Divided We Stand, co-authored with Shankar Raghuraman, Media Ethics, published by Oxford University Press, and the much more controversial Gas Wars, Crony Capitalism and the Ambanis, along with documentaries such as Blood and Iron, A Story of the Convergence of Crime, Business and Politics in Southern India, 2010-11, throw light on the self-serving nexus bringing together big business, politics and crime in India. In the third world, the role of a public intellectual is a much more difficult one, given the fact that the confrontation with the powers that be is so much more direct and in some sense leaves the person vulnerable to attacks of different kinds. In such a situation, Paranjoy stands out both for his professional integrity and intellectual honesty, qualities that are very difficult to sustain in the South Asian landscape, as you already know. A strong state is one that is committed to redistributive justice. Weak and repressive states and governments are not fundamentally different from weak and repressive men. Their agenda is to strengthen the repressive machinery and leave no space for serious reflection of any kind. Paranjoy's talk, titled Corporate Censorship and Suppression of Dissent in India, will enlighten us on the nature of the suppression and how dissent is marginalized in the Indian context. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Prakash Kona. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. It's my honor, my privilege to be here with you. I surely do not deserve all these compliments that have been showered on me. I began a career in journalism about more than 38 years ago. I was in the University of Delhi during the emergency. My 2 years at the Delhi School of Economics more or less coincided with the 21-month period of the emergency, when I think for the first time there was an overt intervention by the state to abridge and curb various fundamental rights of citizens of this country, including the right to free expression. We have different forms of curbing those same rights today, but it was perhaps never as overt and as blatant as it was during the emergency, when all those who were opposed to the then ruling regime headed by Indira Gandhi were just put behind bars, including quite a few journalists. So I guess that period of time had an influence on my decision to become a journalist. I was planning a career in academia, much against the wishes of my father. And today I consider myself truly honored and privileged that I have a quarter of a foot in academia. and which is why I've been asked to come and speak to people like you. Despite my dislike for footnotes and references and my attempt to try and communicate in languages which the proverbial Aam Aadmi or the ordinary people can understand. I have structured my talk today. It's not a formal presentation, it's extempore, it's informal, into three broad chunks. Look at the state of freedom of expression in contemporary India today in general. In that bigger canvas, I want to look at how corporates, I mean here specifically private corporate enterprises and conglomerates, which are based in India. Some of them have an international footprint, of course. Looking at how they have looked at dissenting voices, criticism, and how they've sought to control flows of information and even suppress information. And at Professor Prakash Kona's insistence and some others, at the end I'll share a few personal experiences of mine, in the hope that it would throw some light on the current way in which large corporates look at those who are critical of them. I'm the proud recipient of 4 love letters sent to me by lawyers representing the 2 richest siblings in the country. And I thought my experiences might be of interest to some of you here. And if they're not, you will pardon my excesses and my references to my own experiences. Let me start by giving you about 7 or 8 examples from the very recent past, which throws light on the very, very diverse and different ways in which this term, freedom of expression, it's Article 19(1)(a) of the Constitution of India. It's a fundamental right of every Indian citizen. Har nagrik ka ek maulik adhikar hai. Freedom of expression is a fundamental right of every citizen. The media, the mass media, and I'll talk a little bit about the mass media, derives its freedom from this particular article of the Constitution of India. There is Article 19(2), which seeks to impose what are called reasonable restrictions on that right to free expression. And the problems invariably arise as to who decides and who interprets what is a reasonable restriction or not. So, before I elaborate on these issues, let's just run through a few random examples. On the 25th of January 2012, Salman Rushdie was supposed to address the Jaipur Literary Festival on his book Midnight's Children, not on satanic verses. He was supposed to come there, but there were a group of Muslims who said no, he should not be allowed to come to India. There were veiled threats of violence held out, so he chose not to come. What was subsequently organized was a video conference. He was supposed to address the gathering at Jaipur on that occasion through a video conference. It was supposed to be a 2-way link where he would speak and he would be able to answer questions that would be raised to him at that event. But that never happened. What happened was there were people who were protesting outside the venue of that festival, and the government of that day, headed by Ashok Gehlot, the Chief Minister of Rajasthan, he and his government feared that there could be a law and order problem, so that video conference was cancelled. Example number 2. On the 10th of October 2011, the University of Delhi dropped from its history syllabus a book. It's actually a collection of essays, but it's a book which was written 24 years earlier by a scholar, A.K. Ramanujam. The title of the book was 300 Ramayans. It was published by Oxford University Press. And the decision of the University of Delhi was taken after representatives of Hindu organizations said that there were portions of his essay which they found offensive. So his book was taken off the history syllabus. On the 9th of June 2011, Maqbul Fiza Hussain, one of contemporary India's best known artists, he died in exile in London. He spent the last few years of his life outside India. He was almost like the last of the Mughal emperors, Bahadur Shah Zafar, who couldn't find even a little bit of land for his grave. He feared that he would be physically hurt or damaged because of paintings which he had drawn over a long period of time, actually over a few decades, some of which depicted Hindu gods and goddesses in the nude. He also depicted himself in the nude. He depicted Karl Marx in the nude too. But he drew his paintings in what was then supposed to be the so-called Khajuraho tradition, which some people might even consider pornography. Be that as it may. On the 23rd of November 2013, Bangladeshi author Taslima Nasreen, her book Dikhondito, was banned by the government of West Bengal, which was headed by the Left Front, the Communist Party of India, Marxist-ruled Left Front, headed by the then Chief Minister Buddhadev Bhattacharya. And the book was banned, quote-unquote, because it was feared once again that it would create disharmony, communal disharmony. Hindus and Muslims would end up sort of hurting each other, killing each other. On the 20th of March 2011, the State Legislative Assembly of Gujarat voted unanimously to ban a book written by Joseph Lelyveld titled Great Soul, Mahatma Gandhi and His Struggle. Why? Because there were some reviews which kind of hinted, somewhat ambiguously, that in the book, the author Lelyveld had sought to portray Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, who we all refer to as the father of the nation, could have been bisexual. Now, again, it was very ambiguous, and it's a question of how you want to interpret his relations. But the author was very clear. He says, no, this is an interpretation of what I've written. There is nothing in what I've written which even suggests that Gandhi was bisexual. Be that as it may, the State Legislative Assembly took that decision. There have been many other examples. James Lane's book on Shivaji, and I thought I'd sort of fast forward to more recent times and enter the day and age of the World Wide Web. On the 20th of November 2012, two young women, Shaheen Dada, Renu Srinivas, they both live in a place called Palghar, which is in Thane, which is not very far from Mumbai. It's like a suburb of the city of Mumbai. They were surprised. Why? Because the police visited them and took them behind bars. What was their alleged offense? They had posted on Facebook, social networking site all of you are very familiar with. Facebook is very important in our lives, as you know. Facebook now has more users than the population of this country. I understand soon it will exceed the population of China as well. Be that as it may, in Facebook, these two young women, they had questioned why it appeared that the city of Mumbai, there was a kind of a shutdown of all activities. There was a kind of hartal. Why? Because the Shiv Sena leader, Supremo Balasaheb Thackeray, he was being cremated. And this was the post put by Shaheen. And Renu's big crime was that she pressed that like button. She actually liked what she had said. So they were arrested and put in police custody because the police feared that they may be attacked by quote-unquote anti-social elements, miscreants. They were sent to judicial custody, but within a few hours they were granted bail, they were given personal bonds, and much later, in January 2013, after the Supreme Court did away with Section 66A of the Information Technology Act, or rather, the act was repealed. The provision of that law was repealed later, but at that point of time, while the Supreme Court was hearing this case, it highlighted this example as an example of how police action could have what is called a chilling effect on others. That means by taking action against one person or a few people, you dissuade others from expressing their views freely, fearlessly, especially if those views are critical about people who are in positions of power and authority. They could be political leaders, they could be corporate captains, whoever they could be. And it was also highlighted that this was a classic example of how a particular rule or a particular provision of law was being interpreted and enforced in an arbitrary manner. We saw similar examples also. There was a person by the name of Ravi Srinivasan from Puducherry, and he had the temerity to suggest that the then Finance Minister Palaniappan Chidambaram's son, Karti Chidambaram, his assets were more valuable than that of the famous son-in-law of India, Robert Vadra. And for this terrible suggestion that he made on Twitter, once again he was unpleasantly surprised when in the early hours of the morning he found the cops at his doorstep saying that, they needed to question him, and suggested that he may have violated certain provisions of the Indian Penal Code and the Criminal Procedure Code, provisions pertaining to criminal defamation. I'll talk a little bit about criminal defamation a little later. But this was hardly the only example. There have been many other examples, and I'll touch on more of them. But there's one very interesting example of the 9th of September 2012. A young man called Asim Trivedi, he was a resident of Kanpur in Uttar Pradesh. He drew these terrible cartoons where they showed that lion in the Ashoka pillar with huge talons, and they were dripping of blood. And he was arrested by the police. He was charged with sedition. The charge was that of sedition. It was a good old British colonial era law that he was acting against the state, the sovereign state, the Union of India. Of course, he was. There is a law pertaining to the way in which national emblems, national flags. I mean, in India, the law is very different from, say, a country like the United States of America. The First Amendment of the law is that you can have the American flag, the Star-Spangled Banner. You can design a little bikini out of it. You can burn it in a public place, but you will not be guilty of committing a crime. But you can't do the same thing with the Indian flag. You are then guilty of a criminal offense. So this was really the provision of law under which Asim Trivedi was put behind bars, and subsequently he was, of course, released on bail. I will give you a few examples, but the purpose of my giving you these examples was really to highlight how this phenomenon of suppression of free expression, if you like, is quite pervasive in contemporary India, cutting across regions, cutting across political parties. The fact is that India has a very vast and a varied mass media. Let's not deny that. I mean, just to give you a very quick sort of look at the numbers, India is the only country in the world which has about 100,000 publications registered with the Registrar of Newspapers of India. It's the only country in the world where the government of India, the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, has given permission to close to 900 television channels to uplink and downlink from this country. Out of these 900 odd television channels, somewhere in the region of about 300 of them claim they are news and current affairs channels, of course. You and I may disagree that what is being shown on that idiot box is either news or current affairs, but they're officially classified as news and current affairs, you know. Two snakes getting married, live, exclusive news. Amitabh Bachchan has a headache, exclusive, breaking news. You know, that's also goes as hard news, and that's okay. To each his own. But you also have to realize that India is also unique in more ways than one. We are the only country in the world which not only describes itself as a democracy, but as the world's largest democracy, where news and current affairs on radio is still a monopoly of the government. Now, this is a very, very unusual and an anomalous situation, and some of us have moved the Supreme Court, and there's a decision pending in the Supreme Court, because we believe that it's not even a case of a law being amended by Parliament, it's an executive decision. And it's particularly unusual and to the point of being ludicrous that you have, you know, hundreds of private owners of companies and firms that bring out publications, that bring out newspapers, magazines, and so on and so forth. You have hundreds of companies that produce television programs and broadcast them, and nobody really knows how many websites there are, but many of them are privately owned. And that's not all. You have today a situation where All India Radio, or Akashvani, which is a part of Prasar Bharati Corporation, no longer really has a monopoly on airwaves. You have somewhere in the region of 250 FM radio stations, frequency modulation radio stations. You have somewhere in the region of about 150 community radio stations, and these numbers are going to expand. They're going to go up 3 times, 4 times in the foreseeable future. The government has already issued, given licenses to large numbers of radio stations, that FM radio stations that are expected to go on air in the near future. But what is anomalous is none of these radio stations can broadcast news. It can, in fact, take the feed from All India Radio and rebroadcast it, but it cannot say, here is the news at this hour. It does, in fact, give you news in between all kinds of talk shows, but it's disguised. It can tell you the latest cricket score, it can tell you the latest stock market information, it can tell you whatever has been said by whoever, but it's not like, here is the news at this hour. So-and-so has done this, or there have been people killed, or the Prime Minister has said this, whatever. So this is a very, very anomalous situation. So the other point that's very, very important to note, these large numbers also conceal the fact that you have oligopolies and cartels. You have a few groups or conglomerates that control large sections of the media. My friend from the Times of India is here. Say the Times of India Group is a classic example. Bennett Coleman Company Limited. It's a closely held group of companies, but the TOI is the world's most widely circulated daily English newspaper. Wow, not bad. Half of all the English daily newspapers sold in India, all editions put together, is an edition of the Times of India. Now, a few years ago, there were about 7 or 8 non-English newspapers, daily newspapers, that used to circulate more than the Times of India, but now it's somewhere number 3 or number 4. You know, these rankings keep changing. But you have at least 2 or 3 widely circulated Indian newspapers that rank among the world's most widely circulated newspapers anywhere. If you go to a website of an organization called WAN, World Association of Newspapers, you'll find this. So you have the Dainik Jagran, you have the Dainik Bhaskar, you have in the language of this state, you have Inadu, you have Thanti, you have Anandabajar Patrika, you have Marathi papers like the Lokmat, you have Punjabi papers like Amar Ujala, Punjab Kesri. So you have large numbers of Indian non-English dailies which have very, very wide circulation. But the point I'm making is that these numbers can convey an impression that the mass media in India is reflecting the heterogeneity, the plurality of arguably one of the most heterogeneous countries anywhere in the world. But that is a misnomer. It's not correct. Because a few of these organizations, they have very, very substantial control over large segments of the market, whether you want to divide it regionally or even vertically. And there are no what are called cross-media restrictions on ownership as exist in certain other parts of the world. And I mean, I give an example to highlight what I mean. I mean, I am an unfortunate citizen of the national capital of India called Delhi. It's the worst place in the whole of India. It's the most polluted capital, most polluted urban area of India. I mean, minds are also polluted, not just the atmosphere. But Delhi is the only urban agglomeration on planet Earth where 16 English daily newspapers come out. Only part of the world, 1/6. And I could rattle off the names, but I won't bore you. But the short point is, the top two publications, the Times of India and the Hindustan Times, would account for 3/4 of the total circulation of all English newspapers. So when you say, wow, 16 English newspapers, but actually it's really two that hog 3/4 of the market or more. The question that you would logically ask, what are the remaining 14 publications doing? Why are they vying with one another for such a small segment of the market? And that's because of the nature, the character of the mass media itself. Because the media is varied, it suits individual egos, it suits political parties, it suits people with political affiliation to have newspapers, to have media groups they control. And above all, as Sainath famously remarked, the fourth estate in India is also real estate. The fourth estate is real estate. Media organizations are sitting on valuable land in prime urban locations. They've been given very, very generous leases by the government. They have tall, fancy buildings. The income that it accrues by way of rent is often much more than what publications or the sale of publications or the circulation of publications bring out. So I've sort of labored this point a little bit, but the point I'm making is that despite the vastness and the variety of the media, it's also a fact that you have cartels and a few organizations that dominate the media. Now, when you come to the issue of free expression and freedom of expression, you have to note that these have been constrained and restricted from time to time on account of a variety of considerations. I'm going to only focus on a few of these, but let's look at some of these. There's this whole issue of pressure from religious groups or religious hardliners. You can call them fundamentalists if you like. Then you have pressures exerted by politicians or political parties or individuals with political affiliation. And then you have influence of corporates, the large corporates. And corporates are important. Why? Because they are advertisers, and even today, many large media organizations, they depend heavily on advertising and sponsorships by corporates for the bulk of their income. So, if for instance the Center for Science and Environment writes about how there are traces of pesticides in colas, after a while that story gets a lot of play and then it's quickly forgotten, because you need advertising from Coca-Cola and Pepsi-Cola and Thumbs Up and so on and so forth. You have a big controversy about whether Maggi noodles has more of a certain kind of chemical additive than it should have, and it makes a big story every now and then again quickly forgotten because Nestle, after all, is a major advertiser. So the pressure of the advertiser is real, and therefore that's one kind of pressure. But there's another kind of pressure which is very, very important to note, and that is the corporate sector itself is the owner of the media. The corporate sector itself controls and owns large sections of the media. I mean, to give you a few examples, what was the Network 18 group was just a few weeks after Mr. Narendra Modi was elected to power in May of 2014, came to acquire the Network 18 group. It was earlier had extended a very generous loan to that particular organization. And what we see is that it's really a multimedia organization. And not only that, it's important to note that in today's day and age, the different kinds of media are really converging. So the fact is, aapka muthi mein hai na, that handset that you carry is your media today, right? It's internet enabled. You are a privileged member of Indian society. You are in EFLU. You have free Wi-Fi. So you're carrying along with you your newspaper, your magazine, your library of books, your radio, your television channel, and more. Because after all, the internet is not just a medium of mass communication, it's also a medium of personalized communication. So you can, while you're listening to me, send a quick SMS to your friend or have a little chat with somebody who might be many, many thousands of miles away. You can transact business and so on and so forth. I mean, this is an important change and we must admit it. I mean, we must admit that until as recently as 2004, today we are in 2015, in 2004, there were more television sets with cable and satellite connections in India than telephone lines. Today, I'm happy to inform you that in the city you live in, there are more SIMs, as in subscriber identity modules, that little chip inside your handset. There are more SIMs than human beings in the city. We have a country of 125 crores, that's 1.25 billion. We have about 100 million odd SIM cards. We have about roughly 70 crores, about 700 million, 1,000 million, a billion SIM cards, 700 million mobile phone instruments, of which at this point of time, again, various estimates are there, somewhere in the region of about 250 million, about 25 crore handsets are smart. They help you spell, sometimes wrongly. Sometimes you think you're smart, then you find out your phone is smarter than you are. But more importantly, you can shoot videos, you can record sound, you can do a whole lot of things which you never thought would be available to you at the palm of your hand. In this day and age, where all the media are converging, where the gap or the difference between telecommunications, what was called telecommunications, and what was called broadcasting is completely merged. So we have a situation prevailing where corporates, say Reliance is a favorite example. By next year, Reliance would have rolled out in most parts of India what it describes as fourth generation telecom services. Now, also what you have here is the same group is also controlling large media organizations that are responsible for creating and disseminating what is called content of all kinds. It could be about the weather, it could be about bus timings and flight timings, or it could be about politics, it could be about business. And the chances are, if there is any information that could go against the interests of this corporate group, it could affect their share prices, it could affect their fortunes, the chances are that that particular corporate organization will not want this information to put in the public domain. I mean, and that's but logical, of course. It's nothing new about India. It's happening across the world. So what's new? Answer: yes and no. Technology itself has changed the way we are consuming the media, but it's also changed the way in which the corporate sector has been acting and continues to act. So the domination of media markets by the big few, accompanied in a sense by the marginalization of the small and medium many, in fact restricts choices for viewers, for readers, for listeners. It in fact diminishes the diversity of content. Now, such convergence may make very, very sound, sort of economic rationale. You could avail of benefits of economies of scale and scope. But it also creates a situation where you can curb free expression and you have covert and subtle forms of censorship. After all, these are private corporate enterprises. They are interested in maximizing their profits. They're interested in increasing their market shares. So, in the political economy of the world's largest democracy, also known as Bharatvarsh, also known as India, you have huge challenges for media organizations which are not for profit, which are trying to break out of the advertising revenue-based business model, which are trying to critique or criticize or even play the role of an antagonist or an adversary to elites and interest groups and different kinds in politics, in business, and elsewhere. It's not just in economic terms. The corporate media is a very, very active political collaborator. It seeks to influence voting patterns along the lines of the political allegiance of its owners. And you can disagree or debate this issue, the extent to which it constrains expression of views. I mean, even as general elections were taking place in India on the 1st of May, there is an organization called Reporters Without Borders. They have an annual index on media freedom. It's a survey, so you can again say this survey is not a good survey. They did this survey in 197 countries, and they ranked India in number 140. Out of 197, India was 140. Now, I'm not actually totally in agreement with this particular survey. I think it's the Reporters Without Borders organizations, they in fact downgraded India, and to use the exact words they used, they said that India's score has dipped because, quote, reflecting an increased interference in content by media owners in the run-up to the 2014 elections, including dismissal of key editorial staff. This is what they said. But I agree that in the run-up to the 16th general elections in India, the corporate sector and the corporate media, never before in the history of India has it so blatantly favored one candidate. And it's very significant that the Bharatiya Janata Party's spin doctors, with the help of my brothers and sisters in the media, were able to convert, in a sense, the 16th general elections in India almost like an American-style presidential elections, where two personalities, Narendra Modi versus Rahul Baba, Modi versus Baba, into the personalization of politics. Look at it very simply. You have a population of 125 crores. of which a little over 80 crore, 800 million voters exist. I mean, they are people who turned 18 on or before the 1st of January 2014. Therefore, they're eligible to vote, of which for the first time in the history of India, more than two-thirds actually voted. But the ruling party, the Bharatiya Janata Party, got 31.5% of the vote. And the put together, the two largest political parties got half the vote. And you can say the glass is half full or half empty. You can say half of those who voted didn't actually vote for either the BJP or the Congress. They could have voted for a coalition partner of the BJP or the Congress in one of the two major coalitions. But the point I'm making is that the media in India and the corporate sector in India has perhaps never before in the history of India so overtly and openly supported Mr. Modi's candidature in the run-up to the elections. Now, we all know that political parties don't disclose all the money they spend in the run-up to the election. It's hardly a secret, no? I'm not actually saying something that will be contradicted by anybody. I mean, we have two huge loopholes in the law, in both the Representation of the People Act as well as the Income Tax Act. One law says that, there are certain restrictions on what individual candidates can spend. These are the conduct of election rules, which are enforced by the Election Commission of India. But there are no restrictions on how much political parties can spend. Similarly, there's, as per the Income Tax Act, political parties do not have to disclose the source of income that comes from anonymous donors up to 20,000 rupees. So theoretically, if I have a lot of black money, I can contribute 19,999 as many times to my favorite political party, and my name will not be disclosed anywhere, leave alone my bank account details or my permanent account number. The Bharatiya Janata Party disclosed that it had spent to the Election Commission of India roughly about 800 crore rupees. Some would claim that this is just a tip of the iceberg, and I would go along with that view. But even what has been officially disclosed, as much as 70% was spent on advertising and publicity. It's interesting to note that the single biggest item of expenditure which is officially disclosed by the political parties, and the BJP is not alone. If you go through the accounts of the other political parties, you would find them that this is indeed a trend that you see. Okay. Now, what do we see after that? The corporate media has won, great. Mr. Modi has won. After 30 years, we in India have a political party which has a majority of seats in the lower house of parliament, 282 out of 543. So what if they got 31.5% of the vote? Big deal. We follow the good old Westminster system of parliamentary democracy. First past the post. Next part of the phrase, first past the post. Winner takes all. Okay, great. What happens after that? Early June 2014, a young man gets killed in Pune. Why? Morphed images of a particular political leader appears on Facebook. He apparently has nothing to do with it, but he's bashed up and killed. Individuals in Goa, Karnataka, Kerala, all have been accused of posting comments, morphing images, drawing cartoons against the Prime Minister. What we find is a different climate that has been created. And let's be fair, this didn't start with this government. We saw similar trends with the UPA government. And not only that, let's take two examples, Penguin and Aleph. American Indologist Wendy Doniger's book on the Hindus and Hinduism was withdrawn, pulped in February 2004. Aleph in March, all before the elections. Why? Because the publishers concerned feared, Penguin and Aleph, that their employees would be physically harmed if those books were out. Again, you will be very happy to note that Wendy Doniger is getting republished by a new publisher, Speaking Tiger. In a few weeks from now, the book will be available. If you have any Hindu fundamentalist friends, please inform them. Religious intolerance is one part of the story. Political influence is another part of the story. And of course, I come to the issue of corporate control and corporate suppression of dissent. Let me highlight a few examples before I talk about some examples which are very close to me. But before I do that, I just want to make some things clear. Discussions and debates about freedom of expression, what should be censored, what should not be censored, are as old as civilization itself. So in that sense, there's nothing new. How you depict the body of a human being, male or female, for the public to consume, whether it be on the temples of Khajuraho or on the pages of Hustler magazine, it is a matter of contention and debate. And it has been and will continue to be. So I am here not getting into that debate because it's a separate debate and a separate discussion altogether. I'm not also getting into the whole issue of religious intolerance, what is considered blasphemy, what happened in France very recently. I'm not even getting into what is artistic license, pornography, obscenity, and even issues of copyright and intellectual property rights. They all have a bearing on freedom of expression. But I'm essentially trying here to focus on corporate and how corporates work. Again, we have to understand that in India, we have currently prevailing a fairly chaotic situation as far as media regulation is concerned. First, we have multiple agencies. In this day and age of convergence, where once again, as I repeat myself, the entire media has converged. But you have, for instance, the Central Board of Film Certification, popularly called the Censor Board. It classifies films, whether you can show full frontal nudity or not. In fact, there has been full frontal nudity shown in the case of a woman in Bandit Queen. It went up to an appellate tribunal and a judge ruled in favor. Whether you can show a man's heart being cut up and have that documentary viewed only by medical practitioners or students of medicine. The classification of cinema. It's a separate story altogether that the person who heads the Central Board of Film Certification happens to be a person. My friend Biraj Patnaik describes it better. It's a toothless tiger that cannot even growl or whimper. When a tiger is there, the person who confronts the tiger doesn't know the tiger has any teeth, but is still nevertheless scared. It's like the dog who barks and can scare away a burglar, but the burglar doesn't know that the dog can only bark but not bite. That kind of a situation. The Press Council of India cannot punish anybody or even levy a fine. Its writ is confined to the print medium. You have then the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting. You also have a body like the TRAI, the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India, which is like a technical and a commercial regulator. But it doesn't have the powers, say, of an FCC, the Federal Communications Commission of the UK, nor does the Press Council have the powers of, say, the Office of Communications or the Press Complaints Commission of the UK. But that's another story, another debate. But let's talk specifically, and here I'll come to corporate control, is you have an interesting body called CERT, C-E-R-T, the Computer Emergency Response Team, which is part of a government department called DEITI, the Department of Electronics and Information Technology. That Y is just added on to make the acronym look nice. It's part of the Ministry of Information it's part of the Ministry of Communications and Information Technology. Now, this is a body that can actually block URLs or Universal Resource Locators. There was a very, very interesting example, where the CRT blocked what was considered to be inflammatory messages sent on Facebook and Twitter during communal riots, when large numbers of students and young people from the northeast chose to leave Bangalore and go back because they were scared that there would be some sort of a concerted attack on them. But the interesting point about CERT is when they blocked the URLs on a complaint received by an organization headed by a person with a ponytail. You know him, no? Arindam Chaudhary, the head of the Indian Institute of Planning and Management. Now here is a classic case of a regulatory body which swats a fly with a sledgehammer. Now what happened is they blocked a whole lot of URLs where people had sent things that, who is Arindam Chaudhary, his educational institution is taking students for a ride, etc., etc., etc. In the process, without realizing it, they had blocked a link to the website of the University Grants Commission. Government of India, Ministry of Human Resources Development. Why? Because the UGC had decided that the degrees that were being awarded, or the diplomas that were being awarded by Mr. Arindam Chaudhary's company, his educational institution, or so-called educational institution, did not have any approval of the University Grants Commission. And then they realized their mistake and they say sorry. Now what did Mr. Arindam Chaudhary, what did Mr. Ponytail do? Mr. Ponytail, there was a book written about him. Not about him, I beg your pardon. It was written about individuals who, according to the writer called Siddharth Deb, epitomized the new India, the people who sort of symbolized young India, who've done very well for themselves after the economy was liberalized and so on and so forth. And he took a somewhat critical look at Mr. Arindam Chaudhary and his enterprises. And what happened after that was there was a magazine called Caravan that extracted this particular chapter and made it a cover story, right? And before you could say hello, there was a judge sitting in Silchar in the northeastern state of Assam who issued an injunction against not only the publishers of Caravan, but Google and the whole world and his brother, saying this is defamatory. And the publisher, HarperCollins, it was very close to the publishing time, they decided that the Indian edition of the book would not carry the chapter. So a very, very interesting situation happened where the international edition of the book carries a chapter, but the Indian edition of the book doesn't carry the chapter. It's a separate matter subsequently that the Supreme Court of India ruled that this decision was not a correct one, and that it should not have been taken, and so on and so forth. And it was vacated. And it's a separate story altogether that Mr. Arindam Chaudhary's enterprises or his educational institutions, many of them are no longer in existence. But this is exactly what happened. When Hamish MacDonald wrote a book called Polyester Prince, it was about the story of Dhirubhai Ambani, the late father of Mukesh and Anil Ambani. And that particular book was published by Alan Unwin in Australia. But when its Indian edition was to be, when the copies of the book were to be distributed in India, a judge in the Feces court in Delhi decided to issue an injunction even before the book was distributed. But it was supposed to be a temporary injunction, and the writ of that particular judge extended only to the National Capital Region. But interestingly and somewhat mysteriously, that was never vacated. That particular injunction was never vacated. And the book was never distributed in India except in its pirated form. And photocopied editions of the book, they were freely available. They were available on the pavements and the footpaths of Mumbai and Delhi and Kolkata. And then some years later, a different version of the book came out. Rowley brought it out, and there was an international edition of the book. And Mr. MacDonald's new book is called Ambani and Sons, the Indian edition, and the international edition is called The Mahabharata in Polyester. And they are available today. This is another interesting example of how, through very, very subtle and devious means, these work. Because what had happened to Mr. MacDonald, who is a well-established journalist based in Australia, was his publisher in Australia got these legal notices. Now there's a name for these legal notices. SLAPP. SLAPP, Strategic Lawsuits Against Public Participation. And we're seeing more and more of that happening. In this city, K.R. Acharya was served that legal notice by a Bangalore-based exporter of roses, India's biggest exporter of roses, and one of the biggest landowners in the country of Ethiopia, Karuturi. Why? Because she wrote an article, which was then quickly withdrawn by Interpress Service, which was an international features agency, which is now almost defunct. Sahara, Subrata Roy Sahara, he gives an interview to Tamal Bandyopadhyay, and the condition is the text of that interview will be shown to him before publication. So the interview is recorded, the text, the transcript is given to him, but hello, what happens? Jayako, the publisher, and I'm naming names, right? I'm naming everybody's name. I've not left anybody's name. If I've left out somebody's name, please remind me, I'll name that person for you. Jayako decides to show Mr. Roy not just the transcript, but the entire manuscript, proofed. And before you can say Subrata Roy Sahara, the Kolkata High Court issues an injunction saying, restraining the distribution of the book. This is the same story getting repeated. Then Mr. Subrata Roy finds himself in a very difficult position vis-à-vis the Supreme Court and the Securities and Exchange Board of India. The Supreme Court directs the Uttar Pradesh police to arrest him, and then he says, my mother is very unwell, and you know, he is described as a fugitive. And the law has been kind to him for the better part of the last 2 years. He's been behind bars in Tihar jail. Just before he went behind bars, he withdrew the case against Jayako and Tamal Bandyopadhyay in the Calcutta High Court and said, you're free to publish the book provided you put out this rejoinder. Written in not very elegant English. Mr. Prakash Kona could do a better job if he edited that copy, but it's right up front, saying we disagree with the way the facts have been interpreted in the book, but we respect the journalist's right to free expression, so we are allowing the book to be published. This is the story over and over again. Not facts, but the interpretation of facts. The book is available. There are other examples that I can give, and if you like, I can hold forth on some of these. But sir, I should end, isn't it? 12 o'clock is the time, isn't it? We'll leave some time for questions. Okay, I'll finish in 5 minutes. There are many such examples of large corporates who are not happy if anything that is critical is published against them. Every interview has to be scripted, pre-scripted. Well, Indian corporates are not alone. The world over, there are people who are of this kind. But once again, the problem in India is that defamation is both a civil offense and a criminal offense. Some of us have urged the Supreme Court to decriminalize defamation in India, or what is perceived as defamation, including whether you have willfully defamed somebody. It's whether I say something in public. If I say, Professor Kona, I don't like the color of your shirt, he can say I've lowered his esteem in front of 100 people. And he can take me to court and challenge it. But if I say in front of all of you that Mr. Prakash Kona is a murderer or a rapist, then the chances are he's going to win that case and I'm going to be behind bars. But the issue is a different issue. The issue is, what was something said to deliberately lower that person's esteem, image, etc., etc. And this is a debate that's happening across the world. But in India, some of us are a little hopeful. There's one particular court judgment that has come, which is very interesting. It's come in favor of Money Life, which is headed by Sucheta Dalal and Devashish Basu. It has been a Bombay court has issued an order against the National Stock Exchange, which is currently being challenged, and asked the National Stock Exchange to actually pay money for alleging that they defined him. Why? Because they sent the National Stock Exchange a questionnaire to respond to allegations sent to them that there was manipulation in the manner in which stocks and shares were being traded. And they, instead of choosing to reply to those allegations, they went and issued a defamation notice against them. And the court not only directed the NSE to compensate the editors of Money Life, they even said that the NSE should pay a certain amount of money to charity, to some hospitals. So this is a very, very unusual judgment, which is being challenged by the National Stock Exchange in a higher court. But for the first time, we see an attempt by a section of the judiciary to tilt the scale in favor of the media and against the large corporate. Whether this is a trend that will continue over a period of time, I'm not sure, time alone can tell, or whether this is just an isolated example. I'll just spend a few minutes talking a little bit about this book that appeared, which was published by me about a year and a half ago. It's titled Gas Wars, Crony Capitalism and the Ambanis. After the book was published in April 2014 and formally launched on the 15th of that month, as I had mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, I was privileged to receive 4 legal notices by people who lawyers acting on behalf of Mr. Mukesh Ambani and Mr. Anil Ambani. What is interesting to note, these 4 legal notices which were issued to me in the months of April and May 2014 have not been followed up by a court order. But I must say it did intimidate more than a few people. Yes, it may have helped the sales of the book. Some people thought it was going to be banned, so it was good for me. But Flipkart and Amazon, who were selling the book, were also scared, and we had to convince them that, look, there's no court injunction. It's a legal notice. If a lawyer tells you to jump from the 10th floor of a building saying he's going to catch you at the bottom, are you going to listen to him? No, you may not. If you're a good, rational human being, you won't. But what were the charges? Charges were set. They didn't find a single factual error. They said, you've described Mr. Mukesh Ambani as an oligarch. I said, yes, take me to court. They said, you said that the brothers were greedy and vengeful because they were squabbling and fighting over natural resources that belong to the people of India. The natural gas is found in the Krishna Godavari basin. I said, yes, take me to court. Then they said that you have suggested in your book that the Ambanis influence the government of India to change the portfolios of particular ministers. So I said, if anybody should be defamed, it should be Dr. Manmohan Singh who should feel defamed. After all, he is the Prime Minister. He decides who holds which ministerial portfolio, if I'm suggesting that you've influenced him, then he should be the person who should be feeling defamed. And finally, they said, I'm an interested party. I said, of course, I'm an interested party. I've mentioned everywhere in my book. Only one part of the legal notice I agreed with. They said, you have lowered our esteem, you have hurt our harmed our reputation, etc., hurt our business interests, and you have profited from it. So I said, yes, I have. And please take me to court. So this is the present situation, and I thank the Ambani siblings. If it hadn't been for their intervention, I wouldn't be in my present avatar as a publisher, and I will be publishing more titles. One of them is the republication of a book called The Descent of Air India by Mr. Jitendra Bhargav. He was taken to court by the former Civil Aviation Minister Praful Patel and the former Chairman and Managing Director of Air India, Mr. Tulsi Das. Once again, his publisher, Bloomsbury, pulped all the copies of the book. They physically destroyed it. I still ask the question, why did they not challenge that particular court decision is being challenged? And we'll know the outcome in the near future. And I want to thank all of you for listening to me so patiently. It's my honor, my privilege. I'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
As far as my knowledge goes, since our independence, has there been any time in the Indian history where the corporate control over the media has not been there at all? So I just want to know whether it is a recent occurring that you are talking about, or whether it has been there, and why is it so? And another thing is, while you talk about the situation concerning the Modi condition, I agree with you completely. But at the same time, I also want you to highlight on the situation with regard to the control of the media before Modi also. Was there no such thing? And where are we talking about declassification of files? To me, it appears to be a perennial historical occurrence, not simply the kind of a situation that has emerged in the recent past.
I'll get to the difference. When soon after India became politically independent, the first Prime Minister of the country, the first Defence Minister of the country, Jawaharlal Nehru, Pandit Nehru, Krishna Menon, both of them railed and ranted against what they described as the jute and steel press, we would call it. Jute, the reference was to the new central jute mills, which were owned by the then Sahu Jain family, a faction of his, the Jains, went on, were also in control over Bennett Coleman Company Limited, the publishers of the Times of India. Steel, because the Tata Iron and Steel Company, as Tata Steel was then called, was also a small-time stakeholder in what used to be a very prominent publication of Eastern India, the Statesman, one out of Kolkata. Subsequently, the founder of the Indian Express Group, the late Ramnath Goenka, made an unsuccessful attempt to acquire the Indian Iron and Steel Company. So at that particular point of time, the media there were corporate interests in the media, no doubt. And what Nehru and Krishna Menon, and what also comes through in the report of the first and the second press commission, was that these media organizations sought to influence government policy because of their business interests, because of their other business interests. So the pages of the Statesman and the Times of India would be used to attempt to influence government policy relating to the jute industry, the steel industry, and so on and so forth. This had continued and continues to some extent. I'll tell you the differences that have happened. When there was this great big media boom in the 80s and the 90s, you saw a new category of entrepreneurs emerging out of India who used the profits they had made from the media to diversify into us. The classic case being the then Husker Group and the Jagger Group. They made their money on the Lokmat Group, Vijay Dada in Maharashtra, or Ramoji Rao University, who started in pickles business and chit funds, market. So they after they made money out of the media, they diversified into a whole lot of businesses. The vast majority in real estate, in fertilizers, in chemicals, in mining, and so on and so forth. So the media itself became a source of profits for the promoters of these organizations to get into other industries and develop other business interests. The new development, if you like, is the consolidation of control and the intensification of control by the corporate sector over the media. I gave you one example of the Reliance Group taking over Network 18 and large sections of the Inadu Group. Mr. Kumar Mangalam Birla is the biggest shareholder in the India Today Group, which brings out India's most widely watched news channel, Aaj Tak. He holds today a bigger stake in that group, in the holding company of the group, than the original promoters, Mr. Kumar Birla. The Birlas have owned Hindustan Times. The political affiliations of these media organizations are very well known. And therefore, I do not disagree with you at all when you suggest that in the past we saw this, during the 10 years of the Congress-led United Progressive Alliance government, and we see a continuation of the trend. I am merely suggesting, whereas while you are absolutely correct, we see an intensification, a consolidation of these corporate interests in the media, and I'm suggesting that because of the technological convergence of the media, and because large telecom interests are also involved, these interests are coalescing. And this is happening across the world. I mean, the new owner of the Washington Post is Mr. Jeff Bezos. You see The Economist being owned by Italian car makers. You see Financial Times and the Pearson Group being picked up by people who run Japan's biggest financial services company, Nikkei. So in a sense, this is a trend that you see across the world, and you see that also in India. That's my response to you.
I have a question with regard. First of all, I've never been to India. I know very little about India. And I'm interested in.
Most of us are in the same room.
I doubt it. But it's sort of a comparative question, a macro sort of question. I was wondering about the political legal culture in regards to Indian patriarchy, as well as colonial history. So, how is India different to a place like the U.S. or places in Europe? We hear about these processes in these countries as well. Given the whole Orientalist thesis about difference and so on, particular difference in places like India, could you say something about that?
The answer would be that in certain respect, when you look at the working of the media in the world's oldest democracy, in the world's largest democracy, and sometimes you are here refer to these two countries, is very similar. There are huge similarities. There's no doubt about that. The differences are essentially stem from the fact that in terms of you look at the economies of the United States and that of India, that's where the differences arise. I mean, here you're talking about an economy of India with close to 20% of the world's population, which is $2 trillion plus, and you have an economy with a population of 300 million, that's a little over 4% of the world's population. But even after the Great Recession, it's still consuming about a quarter of the planet's resources, over about $15 trillion. So you're looking at two countries with economies which are very, very different. If every Indian started consuming like the average American, we would need about 2.5 or 3 planets Earth, but we don't have that actually. So one is sheer consumption of media. So the very fact that we're talking about a developing country and quote-unquote developed country also means that patterns of media consumption are different. Simply, readership. The number of people who read a newspaper in India is still very substantial. Until very recently, it has been growing very impressively. And there are reasons for it. Why? Because You have a country where officially somewhere in the region of 1 out of 4 persons still cannot read her or his name. So when you have more people become illiterate, what do they read after their textbooks? They read publications, they read newspapers. So whereas in the US, the circulation newspaper has been on the decline for the last 20 years, and not only because of the internet, because of television. In India, it's only now showing signs of decline and deceleration. Until very recently, it was increasing. And the old story about newspapers being like the sun, you know, rises in the east and goes down in the west. But the differences are essentially stemming from the differences in the economies of these two countries. But in terms of the character, in terms of the character, the complexion, the way the media, the mass media works in both countries, there's a lot that's similar. I mean, corporate pressures on the working of the media are many. I'll tell you some of the differences. I think the Indian mass media represents minorities less effectively than the US does. Maybe this example may not be a good one, but in the US there is Ebony, a publication which is sort of looking at the upwardly mobile African American. We don't have that many examples of, say, Dalit publications, or publications which are looking at the interests of, say, the scheduled tribes. So there are differences, but there's also a lot of similarity. You do have large corporate control, the control of the advertisers, or the influence of the advertisers. You are beginning to have people like John Oliver who take on a big business, but again, they're still not considered part of the mainstream. They're still kind of on the fringes, a little bit on the margins. So I've tried to give an answer, a long answer to a short question, but it's a difficult question to answer. I'm less familiar with the working of the US media and a little more familiar with the working of the media again. The other thing is regulation. And the FCC, the infamous Janet Jackson episode, if you recall. That famous episode, before you knew it, the FCC said you fine. You first pay the fine, and then you challenge the FCC's decision because Justin Timberlake, pulled off the top part of Janet Jackson's dress while a very popular sporting event was on. But the difference was that the FCC said you first pay the fine, and then you say you contest that decision in a court. In India, we don't have such a law. I mean, so for instance, in this city of yours, when your former governor, Narendra Tiwari, is having a good time with a couple of young women, in Rajbhavan, Narendra Tiwari, Narendra Nari, Indira Kisawari, Sanjay Tiwari, Narendra Nari, Narendra Tiwari. All those pictures went all over, TV9 showed it, right? I mean, people said, hello, how can you show this? This is like 3 o'clock in the afternoon, my children are here, how can you show these kinds of pictures? And then what happened? The information about custody, very bad, what are you doing? So he's, sorry sir, I won't do it again. Bad boy, don't do it again. If you do it again, you sort of cancel your license. So that's what happened essentially. So there was no fine immediately imposed and therefore legal challenge. We have these self-regulatory bodies which we can discuss how effective or ineffective they are in regulation. So that's another difference, is the way the media is regulated, or I say the media is become more influential. That your children and their children are consuming the media, more of the media, and for longer periods of time than you or your parents or your grandparents did. And very, very obvious and a simple reason is availability. It's all there, literally at the palm of your hand. So you have so much available to you, so easily available to you that you do consume. I'm not even talking about the content or the quality of what you consume, or the credibility or the authenticity, but in terms of sheer volume. I do believe that people are spending more time and consuming larger amounts in terms of they're listening more, viewing more, and reading. This is my personal view. Therefore, I don't agree with you that the influence of the media has, in a sense, that we are perhaps exaggerating the influence of the media. Having said that, let me give you where I also agree with you. So it's one of those yes and no. It's the 50 shades of grey between black and white. I agree with you that the media, the influence of the media is often exaggerated. I mean, take opinion polls as a classic example. Let me again use another example that I use, the personalization of the Indian politics. So I'd say here the media went for Modi, and Modi was pitted against Rahul Gandhi. You know the doer versus the alleged incompetent, diffident man. But the same media failed to read the extent of popular support for Arvind Kejriwal. Those opinion polls are forgotten. The day the election results are, that a few opinion pollsters are saying, oh sorry, I got it wrong. But see, there's that margin of error. You take the margin of error, it's damn tough. Of course it's very tough, Here we're not talking, we're looking at vote shares. The real challenge is converting vote shares into number of seats, and then you run into amazing difficulties. And you can't fool the voter. I mean, the so-called ordinary voter, she's becoming more intelligent by the day. So yes, and she does not influence the media. But to again take your example, in Gujarat, when Mr. Modi said that we had plastic surgery and artificial insemination or during the Vedic times, thanks to Ganesh and Karna as examples, it didn't attract the kind of attention needed when he was Prime Minister. But then he was Chief Minister of a Western Indian state, and he's the Prime Minister of India. So the same statement attracts different kinds of attention because that same individual is occupying a different position. Having said that, you are right. There are certain kinds of news that are ignored by the media, and it's ignored by media in democracies across the world, including popular movements, including movements that concern the poor, the marginalized, and the privileged. They're not given the kind of prominence more often than not because the poor, the marginalized are not seen as consumers. Yeah, they may be citizens, but more often than not, the media is trying to read advertisers closer to consumers and potential consumers than providing information to citizens or seeking to empower them. That's true across the world. What is across the world is that the media dumbs down. The media insults your intelligence. The media presumes that good news is no news, that bad news is good news. And an analogy which I keep using to Padmaja and others who heard me say the same words over and over again, please excuse me. This is the analogy between the dog and the journalist. There are dogs and dogs, and there are journalists and journalists. There are good dogs and there are bad dogs. We are told in chapter 1 of our journalism classes that dog bites man, no news. Man bites dog news. If dog bites Narendra Modi, it becomes news. If dog bites KCR, it will become news. If dog bites Michelle Obama, it will become news. I can assure you that. But then what kind of dog are you talking about? The watchdog? Or the lapdog? Especially if the lab belongs to an important politician, a powerful government official, a corporate captain, or the intelligent guide dog, So the dog who helps a visually challenged person cross the street or is able to sniff out narcotics or pile of luggage or so on and so forth. So there is the media and there is the media. So one section of the media will dumb you down, will trivialize, will sensationalize. Who cares if there are floods in Guwahati? Indrani Mukherjee, did she kill her daughter or her sister? That's going to hog headlines. Yes, it's the last question.
Three interrelated points.
Please make them brief.
Yeah. So first, when you talk about corporate censorship, I agree, but at the same time, I don't think so. Yes, at its boom right now in media, I agree, but it's not such a new thing. Like, for example, everyone knows Gandhi and how he was sponsored by his fellow Baniyat builders during the entire as early as his movement in South Africa. And
Jamnalal Bajaj is the treasurer of the Indian National Congress.
yeah, no,
Of course.
so my point is maybe right now with liberalism and media in whom it's a different thing. But it has always been there. Ambedkar's annihilation of caste being a speech not delivered is also a form of censorship that he suffered at that point of time. That Ambedkar could not, that the lack of print media for print power to Ambedkar and not Gandhi was something that he suffered right there.
I don't disagree with you at
No,
all.
so my point is coming. So my point is rather that I do not look at the media censorship, and another thing is the suppression of dissent is, I think I have a problem with the word suppression. Because I do not think it's a suppression rather than I have a problem that some news is deliberately negated. When a certain, I went to a survey which says the rape which comes in the newspaper is only, say, rape of minors, not marital rape, because marital rape will create problems of how you define it. Then again, caste. How is it that the Nirbhaya rape gets such a big news, and what happens to rape in the Badam case, or what happens when the Naxalites are raped? What happens in the case of Aspa? So it's only certain news, and that is why I have a problem if you, and this is not suppression of dissent, this is a conscious negation of certain forms of articulation by certain people of India. And my problem therefore is not in these categories of corporate censorship, corporate power, religious power and political power. I do not think so that there are different binaries, and media articulation and ethics are various permutations of this. There is Modi's house, there is Ambani's house, there is Kejriwal's house, media house. I think rather these are definitely various articulations of one of the upper caste Hindu male patriarchy of India. And that is why various alternatives to that may appear in news. But radical articulations against that will never come up in news. And that is why I think media houses are not just, yes, corporate censorship is there, but it's not just for, if we look at corporate or economy at the core, then I think there's a problem.
Okay. I'll react to you. If you don't like the word suppression, you are still being entitled to your views. If you prefer the word control, if you prefer the word negation, I won't have an argument with you on this. Indeed, as I tried to talk in the beginning, there are different forms of attempts to control information, control the media, not have certain issues being highlighted, other issues being played up, and there are various forms of it, of which attempts by the corporate sector is one. I have no disagreement. In 1 hour, I can talk about that much and no more, so I chose to focus on one aspect, also because of my own familiarity with that subject. So, I have no disagreement with what you're saying, that you see this as part of a bigger process, a bigger structure, and I tried to explain that this was indeed the case. So, I have no disagreement whatsoever. You also have to understand, since you talked about the ASPA, the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, how women in Manipur, how they protested, how a large group of elderly women, middle-aged women, stripped naked for the cameras for a picture that made it across the world. I agree with you that these forms of censorship have existed across the world. The famous, the picture which won a Pulitzer, Kevin Carter's picture of the vulture and that initiated Sudani's child. I mean, that guy committed suicide. Go back even more in time. American example. Orson Welles, Citizen King. classic of the silent years. Citizen Kane, many believe, was a very thinly disguised biography of William Randolph Hearst. Everybody, other than all the newspapers that Hearst owned, praised the film. Hearst's newspapers pretended as if Citizen Kane had never been produced. That didn't stop people from viewing Citizen Kane. So at one level, there are similarities and there are common strands and trends that you see across the world and also in India. So, the voices of marginalized, whether they be Dalits, whether they be travelers, are definitely not get the kind of it. If Nirbhaya and her name is still, I can legally not mention her name. I can mention her name, but okay, let me violate the law of the land. Her name is Jyoti Pandey, alright? But I am violating the law of the land because I haven't taken a permission from the social welfare department to mention her name. Her own father said, why do you call her Nirbhaya? Because the Times of India gave her the name? Yes, if she hadn't been from Delhi, if she hadn't been who she was, that particular incident wouldn't have attracted the kind of media attention that it did. If Nirbhaya was an Adivasi woman in the jungles of Bastar or Jharkhand or somewhere else, sure, it would not have attracted the kind of media attention. There are also circumstances that it happened in the National Capital Region at a time when there was anti-corruption movement happening, and the fact that it was able to mobilize a certain amount of support among the largely middle class population of the national capital, that the whole incident took place at a time, or I should say, the governments have had a reaction. You know, they used water cannons in Delhi's winter on a bunch of young people, students who were lighting candles, all exacerbated. But look at what happened after that. You changed the law, right? Now, there was a tipping point somewhere. Now, you can argue that the change in the law would have happened in any case. Why did the change in the law happen at that particular point of time? So, whereas I do not disagree with the points that there is a certain continuity, there are certain trends, there are also certain discontinuities and certain specific events that happen at particular junctures and points of time which also are noteworthy. That's the point. That's the limit. And to some extent, the media has a role to play. The media has its flaws, has its problems, and also let's also accept the fact that much as we love to hate the media, we can't do without the media. And much as we love to talk about all that is wrong with the media in India, we also are privileged as a country that we still have a fairly substantial section of the media which are still able to articulate points of view, dissenting views, critical views. And the challenge is how to expand these spaces. And that's where I disagree with you. When you say it will never come up, I would hesitate using these kinds of statements. I dare say, since I'm perhaps as old as your father, I'm a little less cynical than you are. No, you use the word will never come up. Okay, no.
Maybe whenever there are disturbances within the middle class remaining societies, let us look at the last few revolutionary movements in cities in India. The Jalpur movement, the Kejriwal, all of the Nirbhaya movement. These are all where the middle class has felt very insecure of experience. What is happening to our students? What is happening to our world? What is happening to our
So why don't you say this is a global trend? Why only in India? Why don't you say this is happening across the world? So what's new?
That's why I'm saying I'm not being cynical when I say it will never appear. I'm being cynical. I'm just
In this discussion,
never does.
I'll tell you what. We can have a discussion on this. All I'm merely suggesting is that when you say has never come up and will never come up, let me suggest that I am a little more optimistic than that. I am also using one of my favorite quotes from Mr. Robert Zimmerman, better known as Bob Dylan. You know, way back in the 60s, he wrote a song called My Back Pages. And you will indulge me as a person old enough to be a father. Good and bad, I define these terms as if so clear somehow. But I was so much older then. I'm younger than that now. You have something to ask, Ms. Josna. I know, I think.
Yeah, I think so. But we can continue the discussion outside. Child. Is there a session? I think there's one more regular session.
We have a plenary session next.
Yeah.
We will now have the plenary session by Dr. Meenati Pillai, titled Engendering Digitalities, Performative Selves, Networked Publics, and the Omniopticon Gaze.
We will now have a plenary address on engendering digitalities, performative cells, networked publics, and the omniopticon gaze by Dr. Meenati Pillai. The chair for this session is Dr. Sharon B.S. Ma'am, we'd like both of you to come on stage. The chair for this session is Dr. Sharon B.S. She is currently an assistant professor of the Department of Comparative Literature and India Studies, EFL University. She offers teaching courses for undergraduate and postgraduate students, which include gender and religion, gender studies, women's autobiographies in India, youth culture, gender and contemporary India, and an introductory course in critical and cultural theory for the PhD students. Her areas of varied interest include religion, secularism, law and politics, Islam and India, and urban spaces. Her research papers have been published in several national and international journals and dailies, both in English and Malayalam. I now request Dr. Sharon to introduce Meenati Pillai.
Hello, everyone. In fact, I'm honored to introduce Meena and chair this session. Meena is Professor Meenati Pillai is somebody who we all look up to, as like we share the common hometown, and right from my engagement with English literature, she's somebody whom I have read and listened to and have interactions with and all that, so it's a privilege on my part. And let me move on to my duty. It's like to introduce Meena. At present, she is the Associate Professor at Institute of English, Kerala University, but more than that, she's also the Director at the Center for Cultural Studies, University of Kerala. And academically, Meena has won several fellowships, including the Fulbright and Commonwealth Scholarship. I'll just mention a couple of her, because Meena has also warned me not to read a lot about her publications and her awards and all that. But I'll just mention a couple of major works that she has, major contributions that she has had. One is like her important work, Women in Malayalam Cinema, Naturalizing Gender Hierarchies. It's a very important work which has focus on women cinema interface, and it also talks about, like, it depicts a century of understanding of Malayalam film culture from the focal point of women as at its center. But she also, in this, like, there are questions related to gender stereotyping, marriage and family, matrimony, caste and gender relations, all these questions, and even the question of soft porn have been taken up. And this work is an important work in film studies, and especially from people for people who are working on cinema in Kerala. And also Meena has co-edited an anthology of recent Rohingyan mystery, an anthology of recent criticism, and she has contributed to the Routledge Handbook of Indian Cinemas. Her essay titled Matrilineal to Masculinity, Performing Modernity and Gender in Malayalam Cinema is a part of this Routledge Handbook of Indian Cinema. And besides that, she has a lot of journal articles, and she also engages with all kinds of contemporary events. She has her responses, very strong responses. I remember her response to the Kiss of Love incident, which is published in EPW. So like Meena is somebody who engages with the contemporary public sphere, and she always has a response, a very strong response to what is happening around her. And I'm quite happy to invite her for her paper, Engendering Digitalities, Performative Cells, Network Publics, and the Omniopticon Gaze. We'll listen to Meena and what she has to say related to Omniopticon Gaze. Please.
Esteemed colleagues and my dear students, thank you, Shirin, for those very warm words of welcome. I tried to intervene on your behalf, but I think she read out most of what she decided to read out. It's a real pleasure and a privilege to be standing here. I would like to place on record my heartfelt thanks to Professor Kona and his brilliant team of students. We're all very impressed, Dona and Deblina and Jerin, all of them, wonderful, wonderful, teamwork. Thank you so much. And the wonderful company that Jyotsna has kept me through. It's a difficult question that we are engaging with as far as this conference is concerned. And what makes it so interesting is something I hope would be taken up in the panel discussion of how the very notion of privacy has shifted over, the last century, so to speak. I would like to begin with somebody who I felt was an integral part of this conference. And in fact, Jyotsna and I were discussing this person, Hannah Arendt, right? The moment you come to speak about this public-private divide, it's somebody you remember immediately. And Arendt speaks about how a man who lived only a private life, who like the slave was not permitted to enter the public realm, or like the barbarian had chosen not to establish such a realm, was not fully human. So look at how there's an entire shift. We no longer think of deprivation when we use the word privacy. So earlier it had, the way the term began, it had this connotation of deprivation, and this is partly due to the enormous enrichment of the private sphere through modern individualism. Now, Arendt's argument that modern privacy, in its most relevant function, to shelter the intimate. There are raging debates about the intimate that's currently happening in India, especially in Kerala. So its most relevant function to shelter the intimate was formulated as the opposite, not of the political sphere, but of the social sphere, and this has undergone significant alterations today. Privacy is constituted as part of the political and social sphere, and therefore enters into its pre-modern sense of the word itself. So we are going back in one sense by attempting to, all of us want to go public. All of us want to be on Facebook or, in public spaces. So look at this kind of a feeling that a person who is unable to do that, in one sense, is depriving himself or herself of the right to display, which is something that I'll come back to. But however, I don't want to go into Arendt and her rather detailed discussion about this, something that you can read up. But everything said and done, I have a rising unease whenever I hear of the private-public dichotomy, which has of late revealed inherent flaws under the onslaught of a technology which makes the concepts of time and space extremely fluid and intertwining in its intersections and spillages. The continued insistence, even today, and the rigor in treating them as separate, even when one is steeped in the realization that they puncture and punctuate one another incessantly, blurring even any semblance of a boundary, is, I feel, a political insistence. We continue to have this kind of a conviction that we ought to keep them separate. For the very boundaries are the products of the ideological basis of the division. Partha Chatterjee's by now famous arguments regarding the resolution of the women's question in India is a case in point where he illustrates how the private-public dichotomy was an ideological extension of the spiritual and the material, Indian-Western divide upon which were premised an entire set of discourses around Indian nationalism. However, the notion of privacy remained premised entirely on the secure binary of the private and the public, and this poses a number of problems in traditional societies like our own, where the slogan of second-wave feminism, that the personal is political, is yet to find a sympathetic resonance. We have been talking about this within academic spaces for a long, long time now, but you know how it goes. It has still not percolated down into ordinary, everyday lives of women. For thousands of women oppressed by the tyranny of the private sphere, cyberspace afforded the possibility of a virtual restructuring of space that could at least partially address the epistemological and the political lacunae at the core of the public-private dichotomization. This is something that, as somebody who has lived in Kerala, I have felt very intensely over the past few years. Because in Kerala, what happens is by the time it's 6 o'clock, women are all safely herded inside their homes. So it's almost as though the public sphere is not the terrain that women should be charting. We have large numbers of women who come out into the workforce, but there is a visible hurry by the time it's evening. And you know that the curfew time in many of the hostels in Trivandrum, the capital city, is 5:30. That's a curfew time. And then the university claims that all the libraries are open till 10. So these are the kinds of ironical situations within which women find themselves. Of ideological critique and structural transformations of the founding notions of the bourgeois public sphere. For example, the 2012 Delhi gang rape, the Nirbhaya case, did prompt in large measures the emergence of a digital public sphere in India that was predicated on the gender anxieties of a new generation, which found the Facebook, the Twitter, and blog spheres to be highly useful spaces in writing little histories of the everyday life in India, highly useful spaces in writing little histories of everyday life in India through using chat rooms and blogs as spaces for instituting the everyday as an object of inquiry, as well as also a field of political struggle. We all know, many of you sitting in this room would know how you reciprocated, how you were very vociferous in some of the things that you were trying to voice at that point of time. Another factor that complicated the issue was a rising awareness amongst intellectuals of increasing violence and violation of human rights and gender justice in traditionally strict public spheres. I cannot but remember Arendt here, where Arendt speaks of a vita activa and a vita contemplativa. right? She divides it up into two, and she, of course, invokes the Greek society. But Arendt also says that for the men of Habermas's 18th century public sphere, exuding an appearance of disinterestedness was easy. Why? Because all their needs were met in the private sphere. So they could afford to be very disinterested and quote-unquote good in the public sphere, because everything that needed to be taken care of were taken care of in the private sphere. So this is something that I still remember strongly speaking about to my students when the Delhi gang rape happened, because there were large numbers of middle-class intellectuals out in the public vociferously protesting against the incident. Now, one simple question I asked my students was, how many of these men who are out there would have washed their own clothes, would know how to cook a simple meal at home? So even when you are countering violence of a particular kind, there are structural violences built into your daily lives which you fail to counter, which you fail to take stock of, which is something I think we ought to address at least at this point of time. So the casualties of disinterestedness were women. The casualties of the appearance of public goodness were women. So freedom in the political realm meant force and violence which were justified in the private realm. It's highly ironical. So the romanticized affect which was built around the family, and therefore the unproblematic spiritualization of the private sphere that prevents the percolation of action, of justice, of accountability into it, makes it come under severe criticism of late. Sharon mentioned the Kiss of Love campaign. This is again another instance where young men and women across India felt anxious about the increasing instances of moral policing and the angst of being young and free in India. The campaign, in its spread across different cities and its rising popularity amongst urban youth, again used virtual spaces for gathering force, for social protest and engaging in social activism. It is interesting to speculate on the rather paradoxical creation of a digital public sphere in the social seclusion of the private realm. I mean, you are, after all, situated very securely inside your homes, and nevertheless, you are also trying to be part of a digital public sphere. So, the rise of this networked public in a virtual social world can successfully override the dichotomization of spheres, both literally and figuratively. In societies where the real mobilities of women are severely curtailed, virtual mobility in network spaces offer women the chance to be part of new forms of connectivity, communities, and cyber cultures. I wish that some of the students here would, say, for example, look at how when I was growing up as a student, there was no way that we students were able to access sexual content. You know, it was almost as though women did not have any urge to read these kinds of material. So there are very interesting takes on the issue of pornography, which today has suddenly become accessible to men and women equally. There was a time in Kerala when only men inhabited the movie halls in the late night screenings, where they would be the A films that were screened. But suddenly, this has become, in one sense, gender neutral, because women have an equal access. I'm not speaking about the merits or the demerits. What I'm trying to say are the radical ways in which this is probably helping in reconstituting gender identities and sexualities in contemporary India. So in societies where real mobilities of women are severely curtailed, virtual mobility in network spaces offers women the chance to be part of new forms of connectivity, communities, and cyber cultures. women's initiatives to participate in a virtual pluralistic democracy denied to them, which is very, very important, denied to them in their daily lives, help them engage in critical debates and critique identity formations, subverting ideologies and strategies that seek to contain them. In this light, it would be interesting to theorize about cyberspace as one that refuses the fixed dichotomies of the public-private divide and creates third spaces or alternative spaces of consciousness with production and representations of meaning that are subversive of dominant ideologies and hierarchies. This would especially offer a liberatorial anvil for representing bodies and sexualities that go beyond systemized gender binaries. Many of these spaces, like Facebook or Twitter and blogospheres, also reveal a strategic deployment of emotion as embodied resistance. I can see many young women reciprocating very, very, passionately to some of the Facebook comments. And if you actually walk across these terrains, these cyber terrains, you see how, I don't know whether all of them are women. Sometimes it could be men using women's names. You are not too sure about that, which makes it all the more interesting, I think. Right? These sites often create groups which partake in a coalitional consciousness and that construct narratives and performances geared towards more egalitarian social relationships that transcend the public-private binaries and question the ideological remnants of such unnatural divisions. So it's like Susan Bowdow's revising of the mind-body dichotomy, or Donna Haraway's challenging of the boundaries between the organic and the technical. This whole concept of carrying the cyber public sphere forward can help us embody knowledges and practices as being situated beyond boundaries that are historically and culturally inscribed and hegemonically reinforced. However, these gendered networked public also means increasing surveillance, as many of you would have found out by now. And online and physical vigilant repressive tactics. As has been argued, an increasingly networked world allows participation in a virtual public sphere that continues to be dominated by patriarchal structures. I'll come to this. I'll come to the hate speeches that you have, the tag of slut that is often associated when women respond. So participation is equally structured along offline hierarchies, such as class, such as gender, and therefore consequently excludes already marginalized groups in very, very strategic ways. These observations are opposed to the earlier influential predictions like, say, for example, McLuhan saying that future technologies will flatten out hierarchies. I don't think that's exactly the way it has happened. Or Castells, for example, who says that the impartial digital sphere can actually help lessen the digital divide, which is what Manuel Castells said. So I don't completely agree with them in those points. So even as we speak of the democratization or the potential for democratization of the cyber world, its mobilities and the freedom to reinvent identities and create worlds free from hierarchies of embodied realities, it can also serve to undermine the very working of a digital private sphere through violence and power that keep it patriarchal and privileged. So therefore, all attempts to engender a radical critique of existing social imaginaries of the nation or of community and to create counter-publics and spaces of dissent I think in the earlier, in the keynote address, we were talking about the suppression of dissent. So it's quite possible, as spaces of dissent are also fraught by new modes of surveillance and cyber fascism. I recently went to a small village near Kottayam called Muatupuzha, a small college there where I went to deliver a lecture, and I was ushered into the principal's room. I nearly fainted. 40 cameras in the principal's room, and the principal sits there, and he is, a guest has walked into the room and he has hardly any time for anybody. He's monitoring the cameras, and then he's yelling into the microphone. That girl and boy standing in the corridor, somebody asked them to go their separate ways. It was almost as though he was a neurotic kind of, he suddenly had got this neurosis that, a girl and a boy were standing in the corridor of a college and talking to each other. So what kind of systems are we generating today is a question that at least the youngsters need to ask themselves. Thus, I don't want to go into the politics of it, at least not here. Thus, the offer of virtual mobility for women. There is the offer of virtual mobility for women in traditional societies is at the same time undermined by the equally dispersed and diffused technologies of power that seek to regress dissent, that seek to suppress dissent, control sexuality, and surveil and regulate daily lives even on digital spaces. Women as cyber subjects are constantly pushed into states of copious and permanent visibility that mimic online the architecture of power in the physical world. The political technology of the panopticon, you would all know the panopticon. The political technology of the panopticon can create among the networked internet circuits a feeling of the manifestation of power itself. The idea that anyone can surveil anyone and everyone, and therefore the concept of the omniopticon. The omniopticon, or the many surveilling the many. This cyber-disciplinary network of disembodied selves further undermines the overstretched and fluid concept of the cyber public sphere that I was trying to posit in the beginning of the lecture, whose civic engagement remains confined to virtual political activism. You click a like button and that is the end of your activism. You feel happy, right? So, the promise to women of substituting physical contiguities with cyber contiguities that restructure the concepts of time, space, and mobility and facilitate an easier entry and negotiation with digital public spheres is therefore nevertheless fraught by numerous challenges and complications. What I'm going to do in the next part of this lecture is to bring in an image with which all of you are very, very familiar, the selfie. We've all been taking selfies for quite some time now, right? So I use the selfie as one instance of both this challenge and this contradiction. There's a perceived need today not to mistake the selfie simply as an innocent picture of one's own self. By now, we all know that it's not an innocent picture, but to place it squarely in its context of being a purely digital object. A selfie is not just a picture. It's not a apolitical, innocuous kind of a picture. It has to be placed in its digital context, as a digital object by which it takes on all the characteristic features of a digital object, which are unknown circuits of circulation. You never know where it's going. Unknown circuits of circulation, unknown storages, you don't know where it's stored, and unknown leakages. It leaks. You don't know from where it leaks, but it will leak maybe 10 years from now. So these unknown circuits of circulation, storage, and leakage characteristic features of digital objects. However, as a digital object, the selfie also slides elusively beyond cartographies of the state panopticon in interesting ways, posing itself in ambivalent spaces between technologies of the self and technologies of power. In traditional societies, which nevertheless have been inculcated into neoliberal economies, the selfie becomes the metaphor for the rise of the individual self. And I'll actually be speaking about how different women have come out and spoken about the selfie in these terms. So the rise of the individual self, in contrast to the earlier valorization of tradition and community with its entailing strategies of production, distribution, and promotion of the self. Right? I'm not stopping with production and distribution. I'm also speaking about how we promote ourselves, me incorporated. This process, supposedly operating within a neoliberal governmentality, is, however, characterized by an omni-opticon, the many surveilling the many, as I mentioned earlier. The governmentality of digital objects and bodies associated with them being a virtual impossibility leads to the entry of new regulatory regimes that are both internal and external to the state. So there are new regimes, entering the scene, new regulatory practices, and thus the new and complex relationships that are forged between state policies, ideological state apparatuses, civil society, corporate agendas, which we spoke about earlier, and individual actors. All in evolving new forms of surveillance and punishment of offending bodies. Now, in a culture which is obsessed with visibility, earlier I spoke about how, suddenly we do not speak of, suddenly we have already started speaking about the private as a form of deprivation. So, in cultures obsessed with visibility and images, the selfie is no longer read as an apolitical act confined to the relative isolation of virtual spaces. The representational politics of the selfie does implicate the gendered gaze as a significant theme. Therefore, the possibility that within a capitalist economy that encourages heightened levels of commodification of bodies and desires, commodification of both bodies and desires, and new economies of consumption, women might themselves have imbibed and internalized the male gaze in their resting of agency in constructing the selfie. How do you look at yourself? When you take a selfie, which is the gaze that you are using? Have you internalized a male gaze? Is a question that I would pose to the women in this room. Between this double bind of surveillance and freedom, is it at all possible for a woman to take place within a selfie? Stephen Heath, Nicola would know, asked this very famous question. Is it at all possible for a woman to take place within cinema? I'm asking the question in a different historic context. Is it at all possible for the woman to take place within a selfie? I just take you to an Indian blogger, the words of an Indian blogger. She says, I am my body. I am not only my body, but I am what I look like too. And I find it powerful to represent myself as I am to the rest of the world, or whoever gives a cuss enough to notice. I like the colors, angles, and intricacies of my physicality. I'm okay with what I look like today, and that's a big, massive leap for me kind. She goes on to say, selfies are not by their nature unfeminist. I'm not bringing in academic jargon. I'm just talking about, I'm just borrowing the words of an ordinary blogger. She says, selfies are not by their nature unfeminist. Self-representation is hugely powerful for women. Blogging gives the average person Indeed, the average woman, a huge voice and reach. And you would be amazed just how awesome a lot of these average women are. Unquote. So here you have women who feel that they have all through history been puppets in other stories, that they have been represented by men, whether it be in art or in culture, and they were shaped and sculpted by the hands of others. The blogger goes on to say, for example, sure, the selfie has its own precedents that are not always challenging to the cultural standards of how women are told that they should be represented, but at least the camera is in the hands of the woman herself. It's a starting point, people. I'm quoting her. One of the things that my instinct is often to be ashamed of is that I like to try on a new dress, a nice dress, and then take a photo of myself in it. It's like it suggests a level of self-acceptance. That's a bit, well, unacceptable for average women. Unquote. This woman is here retaliating to a lot of the selfie shaming that you would see on cyberspaces. A lot of people talking about the selfie, talking very badly about women who post their selfies. So, this takes me to the question of how, even as the gendered self gets circulated through the selfie, the self is stored and its privacy is indeterminately destroyed and leaked. There are lots of regulatory regimes operating at each of the steps of these process. Most often, the gendered selfie invites incredible amount of violence, online violence in digital public spheres. The same kind of violence that we encounter in our embodied lives. This reiterates the gender violences that are explicitly there in our own ordinary and mundane day-to-day lives. Most often, as has been pointed out by people like Nishant Shah, there is a tag of a slut. A slut associated with a woman's selfie, giving strong clues on how patriarchal languages and structures mimic themselves in digital cultures too. Thus, you see how our imagos, or our idealized selves, or idealized images of the self, are also disrupted and spoiled by violent sexual language and sexist bullying that you see online. Recently, a number of feminists in Kerala came out against this. Jay Devika, for example, spoke against the kind of shaming that women have to undergo in digital spaces. The moment you post a comment, and the moment people know it's a woman, they start this whole process of shaming the person who has gone in for a feminist kind of a response. So the word slut is not used literally, but has interesting cultural markers. It means, I'm quoting Shah, a woman who is dirty, unkempt, and unmarked by her belonging to a man and his home, a woman out in public. For me, the last part of that has the greatest importance. A woman who is out in public, who is unmarked by her belonging to one man, or nowadays even one religion. Thus, one can see how a woman's body out in public spaces is an offending body, and it has to be punished. This is often a social and cultural punishment sanctioned by the majority of the community, and legal validity is never either invoked or felt to be binding. See, for example, when the Nirbhaya case happened, one of the immediate responses that I encountered in most spaces in Kerala, in most public spaces in Kerala would be, but why was that girl out at 11 in the night? Right? What business had she to be? I mean, there's every chance that you might get raped. And I felt that, in one sense, all the media, the kind of effort that there was in the media to project this was negative to a certain extent, because many mothers started herding their daughters back into their homes by 6 o'clock, because you didn't want to get raped, right? So, however, as already pointed out, the selfie can itself be seen as a subversive attempt to reclaim public and digital spaces by daring to make the private public, and in that sense, celebrating sluttiness. So there are many women who dare to celebrate sluttiness. But it also explicated how digital stripping, digital shaming, hate speeches, and digital rape make online spaces continue the very same misogyny found offline. More importantly, without recourse to many of the regulatory mechanisms that can contain or punish such offenses offline. Many of the regulatory mechanisms that we can take offline in our real lives, we might not be able to take recourse to in our digital lives. The representational ethos of the selfie implicates gender politics as a significant theme in its analysis. Sarah Graham argues that the selfie in the end is about the gendered labor of young girls under capitalism. I'm trying to bring in a different dimension. I know that many of you would strongly disagree with what she's saying. In order to model their bodies as objects under economies of attention. Economies of attention. The ability of the genre to generate self-image and to grant freedom of expression is part of the provocation that it engenders. Women's selfies do claim agency to present the bodies as they deem fit. The Guardian paper, for example, reports that the selfie culture is a new battleground for the Iranian regime. Iranian women taking photos of themselves and posting it online, highlighting the role of self-photography in women's movements across patriarchal countries. Now, ingrained in sexist patterns of viewing, the woman's self-representation is never entirely emancipated from the male gaze. One disturbing dimension of the selfie is that it celebrates the overt sexualizing of female bodies for the pleasure of male voyeurism and plays into the notion that a woman's public visibility hinges on her sexual attractiveness. I had a number of images to show you, but I don't think we have the time to do that. A new study of young people's media behavior in Sweden, for example, shows that girls as young as 10 market themselves using manipulated selfies with duck face poses where lips are pouted and the body is held in sexually titillating poses, unlike boys who take selfies playing computer games. So even in the way men and women represent themselves, there are very, very interesting differences. So the selfie in one sense replicates the conventional macho masculinity and hyper-femininity that is part of our daily lives. Now to the market. The selfie, by virtue of the social forces that act upon it, move beyond the realm of photography and aesthetics to inhabit the niche of a rich cultural commentary on the self. It is a site where the capitalist market molds citizens, but also it is a zone to challenge the stereotype notions of self thus cultivated. Amidst all the explosions of images that we have on television, that is a hallmark of the late 20th century and of the 21st century, the steady expansion of the accessible visuals on the internet. We hardly watch any television these days because there's so much on the computer that we can do, right? So the steady expansion of accessible visuals on the internet, selfies function as promotional pieces of self, rendered flawless and artistic with the aid of photo editing softwares. This is what I wanted to speak about. Each frame delineates personal theories and mainstream ideologies. The revelation of positions on concepts like beauty, power, money, gender, society, and so on. My daughter has a dusky skin, but invariably all the photos that she's sending me home from her college has a very fair-looking daughter of mine, and I told her, where are you getting, what are you doing, have you put on some makeup? And she said, no Amma, it's all the editing techniques that we have, and I really feel very happy that I thought she was brought up by somebody else, not me. So the selfie allows an opportunity to buy, to flaunt buying power. You're always talking about the pixel, what is it, the camera resolution and the editing techniques that are available, the different apps that you download, the photo editors that you have on your phones. So create desire and envy. Create not only desire, but also envy. Remember the old Oneida ad. To market values and attitudes, all in the ambit of the market economy, where the individual in the selfie is recast as a faithful consumerist subject whose body is marked by recognizable products, by branded products. In a sense, representation of an individual in these terms completes the capitalist myth of wholesome living, of the happiness, peace, and joy that is to be had from the possession and purchase of goods. As management guru Tom Peters says, we are CEOs of our own companies. To be in business today, our most important job is head marketer for the brand called you. You have to market your own brand, and it's brand you. Intersecting both private and public spheres at a crucial juncture where identity is being constructed and declared, the selfie also denotes what Ralph Turnell identifies as a shift in the locus of the self. A movement along a spectrum that ranges from institutions to impulses. Breaking away from the conventional expressions based on traditional institutions such as religion, family, the paradigm of the selfie is a representation of the real spontaneity and the paradigm of the selfie, the spontaneity and supposedly unmediated self. Therefore, self-image is saliently transformed into a monument of commoditization and consumerism, in turn directing the subject to relate to the self in terms of the market. That is how you forge your relationships with your own self. Which is the camera that you're having? Which mobile technology? Which are the apps that your camera can support? So, in an age of liberalization and globalization, we see how women groom themselves up into market orientations, turning themselves into spectacles, using their bodies as ageless, size zero objects that are ready to be consumed. This is another aspect that needed to be emphasized. Now we come to the last part, selfie and the pornographic public sphere. Earlier I spoke of the possibility of the rise of a public sphere, but now I would like to also emphasize upon the rise of the pornographic public sphere. It is interesting to think of the concept of the pornographic public sphere, something that critics like Agar have pointed out, where the very word pornographic speaks of cultures of oversharing. Cultures of oversharing where everything is shared and laid bare. For example, you have naked selfies on dating sites. There were a number of very interesting cases that came up recently. The cheating sites, you don't know about that. Invisibility has become an impossibility, and Ben Agar has commented on how the selfie is about presence and absence, and how internet makes a viral presence possible. However, like pornography, these are disembodied bodies that we see on the screen, and to a certain sense, these are also dehumanized bodies. So even when women like, the earlier blogger speaks about how selfie gives them a certain amount of control over their own representation and makes what was merely an object through the lens of the photograph into a subject, there are, however, very little instances of gender play or very little instances or very little ways by which you actually destabilize gender politics. Most of the selfies that I looked at actually strengthened gender representations and gender stereotypes. I tried to make a study, I tried to make a survey, and most of the selfies that I encountered, actually heightened this gender stereotypes. Also, it is imperative that we read the selfie not simply as a cultural object, but as an object of relationship between the sites, different sites of storage, sites of circulation, and as bodies that leak. That's why I mentioned that at the beginning, that this is a digital object. Therefore, at one level, there is a celebration that we see of the selfie as the ultimate object of the right over representation of the self, while at another level, you have selfies strengthening gender stereotypes and objectifications. How much time do I have more? Are you bored? Are you hungry? I'm sure you're hungry. How much time can I take? It depends on how much you can tolerate me, how much more you can tolerate me. Okay, sure. I would also like to make a few points regarding selfies as narrating little histories that we often hear so much about, but also giving the semblance of a mobility which is not actually there, a pseudo-social mobility. Now, selfies always, if you look at many of the selfie celebrations that you have online, selfies always project the democratization ideal, claiming to narrate little histories of average men and women. Now, in a neoliberal economy where the market is open, images are in excess and goods are mobile, people who lack social mobility achieve a semblance of it through the social media where identities seem to be in circulation, which can create a feeling of mobility and liberation. However, this is also based on a miscognizance. It's like the Lacanian I. That is I, but it is also not I. So there is a miscognizance because only those I's that are predicated on a consumable I, which I think is very important, those I's which are predicated on a consumable I are in circulation, explicating how social hierarchies, dominant hegemonic assumptions regarding color, sexuality, disability, and quote-unquote coolness are replicated and strengthened in digital spaces. As one avid blogger points out, the selfie may be a bit to break out of the cage of identity and let go of anxious control over it. But when others consume and comment on the selfie, they aren't helping you destroy that cage, they are shoving you back into it. They are affirming that you are a discrete self, one baseball card in a pack, and your statistics alone will always be printed in the back. Thus, the selfie as a moment of breaking free, of proclaiming your independence over your right to representation, is actually capitulating to the very same logic of the market and the network where you make yourself into a tradable image, an image that can be traded and which can be put back into circulation in the digital network. Moreover, the body that speaks through a selfie is not an innocent body. It is always marked, codified, and structured by numerous ideological markers like caste, class, race, and ethnicity. The so-called liberated subject that the selfie articulates is not spoken in any original or authentic language of identity, but is written in a language already inscribed by multiple poles of affective identity politics. So, there are multiple emotive risks involved in creating an image of the self as body. The risk of being less feminine, the risk of being less white, the risk of being too black, the risk of being too fat, and so many other possibilities. So the hierarchies of gender, of race, of ethnic stereotypes are often seen to be replicated in the selfie. Now, I would like to speak about the aesthetics of the body and the beauty ideals, which seem, however, to be heightened by the majority of the selfies that I saw online, where at the most fundamental level of the apparatus, the camera that you're speaking about, resolution with dark skin in dark light continues to pose problems in smartphone cameras. The photo apps, the filters, and other editing modes, I'm sure Nicola would be able to speak more about it, all these other editing modes continue to emphasize the hegemonic, Americanized paradigms of beauty that have become so homogeneously codified in the global market today. So even as feminist selfies, which flout the standard definition of hegemonic beauty, flood the digital world, there is nevertheless a digital marginalization of selfies that do not conform to the racially biased model of socially acceptable feminine beauty. Thus, such selfies remain ossified. So the circulation is not possible as far as they are concerned. These selfies remain ossified in their private spaces and might not get the circulation or viewership that more feminine selfies would get on the net. The digital privilege accorded to whiteness or fair-skinned women and sexy toned bodies as symbols of femininity create a backlash in having a negative impact upon the self-image of non-white females, particularly black and brown women. Many of the selfies engage in playful and ironic dialogues, both with the idea of women's emancipation and freedom from stereotypes, as also the celebration of sexual power and the liberation from male gaze. I would like to conclude with, a post-feminist kind of note on this. The gendered questions around the politics of women's self-representation in the selfies are mired in a tenuous post-feminist terrain, characterized by the complex dynamics of women's agency, women's desire, consumption, and a proliferation of everyday images of the ideal feminine and the feminist. So for example, Tasker and Negri, in their introduction to Interrogating Post-Feminism, some of you might have read the text, speaks of how post-feminist culture works in part to incorporate, assume, or naturalize aspects of feminism. It's almost natural that feminism is here, it was here, you haven't fought for it. So you take it as a given. Crucially, also working to commodify feminism via the figure of the woman as an empowered consumer. We have a very interesting ad in Kerala these days. I took an entire class of 3 hours on that ad, A girl, a young girl of marriageable age, is about to get married. And the ad is of the Chemanur Jewellers, where her agency and her sense of the self is exerted not by her choice in getting a husband. She cannot choose who her husband is. She cannot choose who she marries. She cannot choose when she marries, how the marriage is conducted, but she can choose the jewelry store from where she purchases her jewelry. That is empowerment. So this is it's almost a 3-minute ad where the girl is all jittery about telling her dad something, and we all, the audience gets the feeling that, she's going to talk about a personal choice as far as her partner is concerned. And towards the end of the ad, she says, can I choose the jewelry from the store from where I get my jewelry? And everybody is happy because it's Chemanur. So that's the ad. So assume or naturalize aspects of feminism on one hand, while also commodifying feminism via the figure of the woman as the empowered consumer. Emphatically, white and middle class by default, post-feminism is anchored in consumption as a strategy for the production of the self. Thus, while remaining mired in a consumerist economy, it nevertheless invokes the rhetoric of feminism for its support. of the empowered female. The selfie often becomes the most apt digital metaphor for the marginalization of feminist politics within post-feminist cultures. I think that's something, that's a point that maybe you can work on a dissertation. Both the construction and rejection of femininity, its celebration and renegotiation are predicated upon the male gaze that seeks to create a binary opposition between feminism and femininity, or subsumes the former in the latter. In its enabling and delimiting potential, the selfie is symptomatic. It's symptomatic of the gendered coding, regulation and control over women's bodies, the disconnect between female agency and social power, the disjuncture between post-feminist cultures and feminist politics, and the severe, what we can call, feminine neurosis that cultures of misogyny engender on both digital spaces and in consumer societies. Thank you. I think, crossed my limit.
Thank you, Meena, for that interesting paper. I know there are lots of questions and all that. We'll have about 10 minutes for questions. Chairing the session, I bind my privilege to ask the first question. So, Meena, I totally agree to this idea of spaces of dissent and how cyberspaces, these spaces of dissent in turn turn out to be spaces of surveillance, how the male gaze becomes a predominant determinant to control female sexuality and all that. But I was also thinking in terms of an autobiographical act. Autobiographies have been so important in feminist histories. And can we think about selfie as an autobiographical act that at the interstice of male gaze and this performative self, is there a possibility of a spectrum of engagement with various technologies of self happening, like self-creation, ranging from creation to annihilation? I ask this because the sexual dichotomy itself has been problematized now in terms of multiple manifestations of genders. We have the second, third, up to the fifth gender people are talking about. So in that sense, can we pin down to this idea of male gaze as a fixed norm or entity and look in terms of kind of dichotomy where the entire thing is being driven by the male gaze or so?
I was not speaking about the male gaze as the male gaze per se. What I tried to put forward is the idea that this gaze is also, as much as it is underlined by patriarchal concerns, as much as it is underlined by patriarchal concerns, there is also the market playing a very, very crucial role. So I would say that I would locate the structures of patriarchy in the structures of capitalism. And I would say that these are two forces. I mean, by male gaze, I do not mean male gaze in that sense, where what I'm saying is that women who are the autobiographical subjects might as well have internalized the male gaze. So what they seek to represent and how they represent might itself be complicated by the kind of gazes that they have internalized. So we need to question that very gaze at the center of that representation. I'm not saying it's not possible, it's quite possible, but we need to do it in an example.
Elaborate theorization on selfie. I was just wondering, in continuation to the same question, it is not simply the male who determines the kind of the image that is being simulated by a woman on the internet, for example. It is also, there's a societal aspect, and that is the reason why perhaps people are now talking about gender studies, and not now, but for a very long time. Gender studies where it is not just the male voyeur, but it is also the female is as much a voyeur in the construction of the feminine self. information on that. The second one is slightly, rather shall I say, a very funny question that I have. Let us invert this paradigm and see how does the female gaze constitute the masculine self? Is there anything called a male selfie? And then how does the female gaze, if at all there is something, I just wanted to throw light on that. And there's also, you have been working on masculinities, so probably that might also be interesting in order to cover the area. That might help us, as now there's a popular dictum in academics at least, that the male is the marginalized. So let me just put it.
I would say that, in the light of what I've been working on, there has been a male crisis, a crisis in masculinity, where a lot of men do feel threatened, and a lot of women also do feel threatened, the moment you start speaking about the male gaze. Now the problem there is, it's not a dividing of camps between men and women, where in the Indian context, in the kind of context that I am coming from in Kerala, I have felt that women have internalized the male gaze much more than men have. So the entire structures of patriarchy which have been internalized by women, which makes them much more harsh in their criticism of women who have more agency than them, who have more control over their own selves and their own representations, makes it extremely problematic as far as I'm concerned as a researcher. And in one sense, the question that Sharon was asking is tied up with what you are also trying to point out. But part of the answer lies in what I was trying to say in my paper, where I said that when I was growing up, when I was a teenager, maybe a quarter of a century back, this whole complete silence regarding sexuality, regarding desire, for example, of women's bodies, and we would never ever think of looking at a male body. I mean, that was considered to be something that was anathema. But the opening up of these spaces, the opening up of these kinds of discourses and the availability of these discourses and narratives to young women here, I'm sure posits or makes possible the availability at least of thinking about the female gaze. I cannot say that we have arrived, but the possibility of thinking about a woman, looking, and is it any different from a man looking? I think that thought itself is, in one sense, highly liberating, if I can say, to say the least. Does that answer your question at least partly?
The first part of your very interesting talk. How would a passport photo compare with a selfie? In some way, I'm asking this, because in some way or the other, that was considered a record photo for various kinds of purposes related to governance, government of a different order. And here we are talking of a market-based kind of a regime of documentation of selves at sometimes of autoethnography or whatever in some other ways. How do you think that there's any sense in comparing these two? And if at all, at what level? Earlier we called passport photos, now we might call our card photos or whatever. But do they compare at all?
I would say that even the passport photo is not all that innocent. It is marked by different categories. And you could say a lot of things from looking at a passport photo. So it's not as innocent. By saying that it's a passport photo, it's not as innocent as it sounds. And in the 80s, I still remember there was all this talk about the women thought that passport photos were safe. But then somebody's passport photo got morphed, to something else. And there was all this talk about how even a passport photo can be used for other purposes.
No, I meant in terms of what kind of regime of governmentality is to invoke at two levels, is what I want.
I would say almost the same. Almost the same.
actually look at the space where selfies get displayed. Like, selfies are often uploaded as display pictures, right? And I have seen an interesting phenomenon that back home in Kerala, certain section of women hesitate to upload selfies as display pictures. Instead of that, they prefer groupies, where they'll be seen with their kids, their husband. You know, this is an interesting phenomenon where, you know, I feel that they sort of associate selfie with narcissism, vanity. So this idea is there in our mind. So what do you have to say about that?
It's been there. Remember when Facebook came into being, a lot many women, especially in Kerala, would not post their pictures.
Yes, that's
They
true.
would not.
Yeah,
They
it's
were
still
so
there.
frightened about posting their pictures, and they did not do anything that would reveal their the bodily images on the sites. But of late, I think this has. Of late, I think the fear has been overcome to a certain extent, but still the pressures of ideal femininity continues, and lots of women do refuse to capitulate to the logic of the selfie by saying that, you know, we are still not too sure where it would be stored and from where it would leak. They seem to know that it's a digital object after all.
Self-portraits are as old as representations. A few years ago, selfies were looked down upon. People who would put up selfies on social media, that they had no friends to take a picture. But now it has been accepted, and it's now quite a trend. In cyberspace is something that resists theorization. Would you read that much into selfies? That a woman who takes a selfie of herself could do it for many other reasons than that of a particular kind of gaze. It could be to highlight different parts of her body, for example, her hairstyle or her assets. It is not something that. Yeah, what I consider, her sexual effects. Yeah.
What do you consider as?
She's not a white woman, but she's one of the most popular, selfie takers. So it is not something that could easily be theorized in plain words.
You're talking about the failure of my paper.
No, I'm
And
not
the
talking
fact that I failed to theorize the selfie, and you're not entirely convinced.
No, it is a self-portrait is something that has happened over the ages.
That's precisely what I was trying to say, that a selfie is not just a self-portrait, and it carries different registers that need to be decoded, and we never know where it's going. I mean, the sites of storage and the circuits of its circulation, its leakage are all integral parts of the selfie. And so there is a certain politics that the selfie embodies.
But every picture now with a digital object, would you think of it like that? Even probably a self-portrait of Rembrandt or something.
I mean, these are all images that I have there, and if you have the time, maybe you could browse through them. It's all there. There are a number of videos that I have downloaded of the selfie stick, for example.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And engage on moment here with discussions and all.
Thank you, Dr. Meenati Pillai, on your interesting talk. I'm sure we all had a lot more questions, but I'm sure she would invite some more talks outside the hall.